The 1950s were rife with the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Phrases like "in God we trust" and "one nation under God" became like a daily mantra in some households. The onset of the 1980s and 1990s, however, saw the rise of the Satanic Panic, and the Fall River cult murders fanned the flames of hysteria. Stories of abuse at the hands of Satanists spread like wildfire, and to be fair, most of those were debunked. And just like the great killer clown scare of 2016, you gotta wonder how many teenagers were just taking advantage of the hysteria and playing pranks on people. Nonetheless, there was actually a small group of sex workers in Massachusetts that self-identified as a satanic cult, going so far as to perform blood rituals and animal sacrifices. But sacrificing a goat is a far cry from the type of brutality that was inflicted upon 3 young women by a select few members of this group. And to be totally fair, I would also consider a Satan-worshipping group of, anyone performing blood rituals in the woods to be a cult, or maybe a coven, but definitely something dark and taboo. Hey besties, and welcome to the Crafty Crimes podcast. Today's case is complicated. 3 young women between the ages of 17 and 22 were seemingly ritualistically murdered in Fall River, Massachusetts. I know I said I wanted to stay away from cases involving minors, and I do. I really do. But it's a lot harder than you think. We live in a world that is sometimes sad and cruel, and this case definitely makes the world seem a little more hopeless. All 3 bodies were found with similar wounds and mutilations, but different people committed every murder. At the center of this sad and bizarre tale is a young girl aspiring to be a pimp. And she just so happened to be the only person present at all 3 murders. Everyone in this case suffered some kind of physical or sexual abuse, and 3 of them would go on to become perpetrators of physical and sexual abuse themselves. Everyone else, well, they continued to be the victims of physical and sexual violence until they either ended up dead or managed to escape. And the ones who managed to escape ended up with PTSD, depression, anxiety, and a slew of other problems from what this lifestyle did to them. It's not a pretty tale. And while we talk about the ugly horrors of humanity, I am going to be making a bunch more of these. These are some cute little daisy squares on a green background. I'm going to be making a bunch of them so that I can make a cute pair of summer overalls for my daughter. I have about 7 more to make, so we'll see how many we can get done during this episode. So yeah, let's get into it. Fall River, Massachusetts has a history steeped with satanic panic, supposed hauntings, and desolation, making it the perfect backdrop for a Satan-worshipping cult of sadists. Almost 90 years before the Fall River cult murders was another tale you all might be familiar with, the infamous Lizzie Borden murders. Despite its haunted history, Fall River and the surrounding areas were once prosperous. The town was founded in 1803 and was incorporated as a city shortly after in 1854. This was the peak city founding era for the whole country due to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of manufacturing. Bristol County, which houses the towns we'll discuss today, was a child of this era as well, boasting a booming textile industry. Unfortunately, like a lot of cities across the country, it wasn't sustainable, and over time, manufacturers moved to larger cities, leaving Fall River in a recession in the 70s. The area was destitute, and a 4-block area of the town turned into a red light district. Interestingly enough, this red light district was just a block and a half from the police station. By the late 70s and early 80s, sex work and drug abuse ran rampant, drawing in younger women and teenaged girls. A vicious cycle of abuse that started in the homes of Bristol County residents continued on the Fall River streets. The underground industries had become so prosperous that traffic would be backed up for several blocks on weekends, with 30 to 40 women working the 4-block district. 2 people battled for control of the working girls. 17-year-old Robin Murphy, and yes, you heard that correctly, 17 years old, and 26-year-old Carl Drew. They controlled their respective corners with fear, threats, violence, and alleged blood rituals in worship of Satan. The person at the center of this story, the only person who was present at all 3 murders, was Robin Murphy, a 17-year-old pimp. Robin had a reputation for unspeakable violence, often fist-fighting grown men as a teenager. The detectives who worked these murders and spoke to Robin considered her to be vicious and a master manipulator, and I happen to agree. And while it's hard to believe that a pretty teenage girl can mastermind 3 murders and make them look like ritualistic satanic offerings, I can assure you that this is exactly what she did. The first victim was a local teenager, Doreen Levesque. She was a beautiful girl from New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is about 15 miles east of Fall River. While I can't tell you for certain what happened to Doreen during her childhood, it's safe to say that it wasn't good. Teenagers with supportive parents and a stable financial situation aren't going to resort to turning tricks and living in drug dens to survive. Likely to escape some form of instability or abuse, Doreen made the journey to Fall River and began to sell herself to strange adult men. And can we just take a moment to let that settle in? I know we all know that it happens, but just like really take a moment to digest the fact that men knowingly picked up a teenager. Like, that's gross. Gross. Unlike many of the other prostitutes in Fall River, Doreen worked for herself, turning down offers of protections from pimps, including Robin Murphy and Carl Drew. And while no one can know for certain, it's believed that Doreen was killed for refusing Carl Drew's services. Regardless of the reason, no one deserves to go out the way she did. On Saturday, October 13th, 1979, the naked body of 17-year-old Doreen was found face down under the bleachers at Diamond Vocational High School, which is weird because she didn't attend high school at all. Doreen's Friday night didn't look like the Friday night of her peers, with weekends being the busiest days for working girls. Doreen likely spent the early parts of that evening in the red light district before her night turned bad. Like, bad. Detective Alan Silvio was one of the first officers on the scene when they found Doreen's body, and what he saw that morning has haunted him ever since. According to the autopsy report, she was 5 feet tall and weighed just 90 pounds. Doreen had been tortured. Her hands were bound with fishing wire, and she had been sodomized with a baseball bat, which, Jesus fucking Christ, guys. As morbid as it is, I definitely hope she was already gone before that started, because, oof. I don't know, man. I don't even have a descriptor for that one. Her body was covered in wounds from being stoned, which was probably the first indicator of some kind of cult activity. Stoning was a common biblical punishment for women, so stoning a woman to offer her soul to Satan seems like the kind of thing a quote-unquote satanic cult would do in mockery of God's ancient laws. Additionally, her throat had been slashed and an X was carved into her chest. Yikes, let's talk about overkill there. 26 days later, a father walks into the Fall River Police Station to report his daughter, Barbara Raposa, missing. Barbara was a 22-year-old prostitute with an infant son and a drug and alcohol addiction. Her boyfriend, Andre Andy Malte, assumed himself to be the father of her child, but honestly, with Barbara being a sex worker, it's almost impossible to know who the father is without a DNA test. Regardless, remember this name because it'll come back later in a very big way. Between when she was reported missing on November 8th, 1979, and the end of the year, Andy Malte would contact law enforcement 3 separate times to ask for updates in Barbara's case. On January 26th, 1980, about 3 months after the awful murder of Doreen, the top half of a skull was located in the woods by some hunters in Freetown State Park. Locals believe the 5,000-acre reservation is extremely haunted, so when they found out a satanic cult was operating in those woods, they weren't surprised in the least. Maybe those woods are haunted, or maybe teens did teen things in the seclusion of the trees that led to rumors of haunting. Or maybe it's both, who knows? In the midst of the Satanic panic, though, there wasn't really much of a difference. A Westport, Massachusetts detective by the name Alan Alves staunchly bought into these rumors. Detective Alves was considered an expert on satanic cults during the Satanic Panic and firmly believes that most of the stories about satanic abuse were true. According to Alves, Satanism is alive and well in the worst forms, claiming that government officials and authorities are all aware of these satanic sects because they're the majority of the members. His interviews with the producers of a documentary entitled Fall River gave the impression that he believed allegations of satanic abuse were true more often than not. To his credit, in this case specifically, the members of a self-identified satanic cult did abuse people. However, I do seriously doubt the validity of a government-wide conspiracy to form satanic cults. The probability of a secret that massive, shared by that large of a network, staying secret is slim. Because, 3 men can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. The only way investigators were able to identify Barbara's broken body was with forensic dentistry. Her skull had been so brutally smashed that she was unidentifiable based on her looks. The upper mandible was the only piece of Barbara's body that was intact enough to use for identification purposes. A chunk of her hair had even been ripped from her head. Now that is a lot of rage. Remember Andy Malte, the boyfriend and possible baby daddy of Barbara? The one who kept checking in with law enforcement for updates on her disappearance? Yeah, that guy. He is probably the worst person in this entire story for no reason other than his constant predation and sadism. Andy had a reputation around Fall River as a pedophile, a sadist, and a violent rapist. Lots of sex crimes going on with this guy. And reportedly, he began molesting Robin Murphy when she was about 11 years old. I was not sad to learn he died from cancer in prison in the late 90s. He was also a member of Carl Drew's self-identified cult. While Andy himself wasn't a pimp, he was a frequent flyer. Frequent enough that he had an entry into a cult made up entirely of sex workers. Interestingly, Andy's house was located in between 2 of the murder sites. On February 5th, 1980, Andy walked into the police station, Bible in hand, to talk to police about his girlfriend's disappearance. He told police that he had once been a Satanist, but has since been born again. Can I get an eye roll from the Christians in my audience? As a born-again Christian, God had blessed Andy with a psychic dream of Barbara's murder. In this dream, he claims angels carried him over the trees and that he watched Barbara being murdered. He was able to provide details about the crime in this weird confession in disguise. I mean, did he really expect investigators to buy the, "oh, I had a dream about it" angle? The DA asked Andy if he'd be willing to walk police through what he saw in his psychic dream at the crime scene, and Andy agreed. In the woods of Freetown State Park, Andy walked police to the spot where Barbara had died, pointing out an indent in the ground where her head had lain, and had told the police that Barbara's head had been smashed with a rock. He somehow even knew Barbara's time of death. He ended up spending 3 hours with police at the scene, and shockingly, he was permitted to go home that night. Man, that had to have been such a vivid dream. How kind of the Lord and his angels to reveal this hidden knowledge to Andy and Andy only. Obviously, he knew what happened, and unless you believe in this psychic dream from God nonsense, it's pretty obvious that Andy was there when Barbara died. Police were now looking at Andy as the perpetrator of Barbara's, and maybe even Doreen's, murder. As soon as Robin Murphy caught wind of Andy's trip to the police station, she took control of the narrative. Bypassing investigators entirely, Robin went directly to the DA's office on February 6, 1980, to strike a plea deal in exchange for her testimony. The DA was in desperate need of more information on the case, and Robin Murphy had that information. With no better options, they agreed to the plea deal. In exchange for immunity for the murders, Robin Murphy confessed to being present and being forced to participate in both murders. Her confession led investigators to several other area prostitutes who either witnessed the murders, were forced to participate, or who had been given first-hand accounts of the crimes. In her confession, she implicated Andy in the murders, but this was only one of several conflicting stories. The most forthcoming witness, and the third murder victim, was 20-year-old Karen Marsden, who just so happened to be Robin Murphy's girlfriend and the roommate of a woman named Carol Fletcher, who we're going to meet again later. Karen had begun working as a prostitute for Robin's main rival, Carl True, in February 1979. She left sex work just a few months later after Barbara's murder because she feared for her life and the life of her 2-year-old son, JJ. Apparently, everyone who knew Karen was surprised when she turned to sex work to make money. Karen was seen as a sweet, hardworking girl. Before beginning the line of work that would cost her life, Karen worked as a bartender at a local bar where pimps and prostitutes would go to pick up Johns. Maybe that's how she got into it, just being exposed to the options and getting to know some of the other girls who worked in the area. People were even more shocked to find out that she worked for Carl Drew, especially considering Robin was her girlfriend. Carl had a reputation for extreme violence and was considered the leader of the Satanic cult operating in the area. Again, was it Satan or was it prostitution and violence with a satanic label slapped on it by worried Christian families at the height of a cultural scare? Based on Karen's sweet demeanor and Carl's propensity towards violence, not to mention the rumors about Satanism that seemed to follow Carl, it's no wonder Karen feared for her life. Karen's confession was more chilling than her girlfriend Robin's. trying to record on the 4th of July, huh? Carl was not a good dude, and he did not have a good home life. Growing up in New Hampshire with an alcoholic father was hard on Carl. One of his most horrid memories of his father was being tied by his feet and lowered head first into a well to retrieve rats, which is a pretty fucked up thing to do to anyone, let alone a child. At the age of 14, Carl ran away from home and made the 75-mile journey to Massachusetts to start fresh. But his fresh start was more rotten than anything. Instead of turning his life into something more positive than what he saw growing up, Carl joined the criminal underbelly. One of the first things he did when he landed in the state was hold up a convenience store in New Bedford. He received a 6-year sentence and then he was released on parole. Because of his first conviction ending in parole, Carl Drew was now unable to leave Bristol County. So, naturally, he continued a life of crime and became a violent pimp who threatened to tie women to trees, inject battery acid into their veins, and dump their bodies in algae-covered ponds. The women who worked for him and the women who knew him by reputation were terrified of him. One of his girls went by the street name Cookie, and she informed police during the investigation that Carl regularly threatened to tie them to a tree and drown them in the blood of a live goat. Who even comes up with something like that? So, he's not a good dude. It makes me wonder if Robin Murphy was able to break into the pimping scene so quickly because her violence was targeted towards men. Robin was more of a discreet type of controlling with her girls as well. Robin's tale to the DA's office was sparse on details, probably on purpose. According to Robin's first testimony, Andy had killed Doreen as a sacrifice to Satan in an attempt to conjure a physical being, as in a physical, evil, Satan-like entity. And a side note, that is so freaking dumb. Like, do they expect that the presence they consider to be the father of all evil to take pity on them? Appreciate them? Like, bro, you're unlikely to survive the night. The deity you're summoning literally wants to enslave and hurt you, but pop off with your delusions of grandeur, I guess. Anyway, between Robin's tales of satanic rituals, the absolutely brutal murders, Andy's quasi-admission to actively practicing Satanism, and Detective Alves asserting that Satanism is alive and well, it's not hard to see why Bristol County was gripped with fear and boiling holy water by the batches. In contrast, Robin testified to the DA that Barbara was killed in an act of passion for cheating on Andy with a man named David Cohen. And she was not a sacrifice like Doreen was. Allegedly, Robin and Andy picked up Barbara from a diner around 1 a.m. and the three of them shared a joint. After driving for a while, Barbara and Andy got into an argument. Robin sat in the back seat while Andy pulled Barbara out of the car by her hair and dragged her into the woods. Robin stayed in the car, just, chilling in the back seat as one does, while Andy brutally raped Barbara and smashed her head in with a rock. Robin admitted to hearing Barbara scream from the woods, and when she turned to look, she saw Andy straddling his girlfriend with a large stone raised over his head. Her response, well, it was to turn the radio up louder. Robin finished her testimony by saying she never actually saw Andy bring the rock down on Barbara's head. And now Robin Murphy has full immunity for her involvement with 2 murders. Andy had a very similar story. It's amazing, really. But he kind of forgot to mention the part where he was the one holding the rock. The strange thing about Robin is that as I listened to her recount the murders of Barbara and Doreen, I noticed how devoid and empty she seemed. There was no emotion at all in her voice, and she told the tale like she was reading a textbook. And this testimony was enough for police to arrest Andy Malte on February 7th, 1980. Now, maybe I could see the act of passion argument if Andy had stopped with a few smashes to the head, but what actually happened goes so far beyond the rage of a jealous boyfriend. Robin also told the DA that Andy had forced her to participate in Doreen's murder, saying he forced her to slit Doreen's throat and threatened to kill her if she said anything. So naturally, that's why she hadn't come forward sooner. Karen Marsden, who was also present at Doreen's murder, had a much darker and more graphic tale to tell. Her police confession of her involvement with Doreen's murder began on February 8th, which would end up being her last day alive. She spent several hours that evening with Detective Sylvia, walking him through the Freetown State Park ritual areas. During the hours-long tour, Karen was able to provide all the sordid details of Doreen's murder. Unfortunately, another dark spot on this case is that Doreen's murder is still technically unsolved. There's no physical evidence to tie anyone to her death, and the only person willing to tell the truth suffered a similar fate. Doreen's final night alive went something like this, according to Karen. She was picked up from her corner by Carl, Robin, Karen, and a man named Willie Smith. From there, she was driven into the woods behind the high school and brutalized. In Karen's testimony, Robin had helped drag Doreen from the car by her hair. Her hands were then tied above her head, and she was raped by the men in the group, and at some point, anally raped with a baseball bat. From there, the group gathered around Doreen and threw rocks at her. Carl then made Karen slit Doreen's throat. When she was done, Carl carved an X into Doreen's chest, chanting foreign words in a low, scratchy voice. The blood from Doreen's chest wound was spread across Karen's forehead in the shape of a cross, indoctrinating her into Carl's cult. In Karen's version of events, Robin was very much an active and willing participant and even encouraged other people in the group to participate. With all of these grotesque details, it's not hard to see why Karen tried so hard to leave that lifestyle behind her after what she had been forced to do. Now, do you remember how I said Robin claimed Barbara was killed for cheating on Andy and that's why she was killed? Well, that's what we're going to focus on now. Why? Because at the same time Karen Marsden was giving her testimony to police, Robin Murphy was implicating a man named David Cohen as someone who may have been involved. There's really not much to say about David. Quite honestly, he seems to be the only decent man in this story. He stayed out late into the night to try to find Barbara and bring her home safely to her son. Maybe in a different life, they could have been happy together. David's interview with police provided a more complete picture of what happened on November 7th and 8th. On November 7th, 1979, David Cohen picked Barbara and her son, Eric, up from Barbara's apartment and took Eric to a babysitter for the evening. The original plan had been for the couple to grab dinner together and see a movie, but after dropping off her son, Barbara asked to work the streets for a couple hours instead. The pair planned to meet at a bar in the red light district around 1 a.m. But they wouldn't meet again, and not from lack of trying on David's part, actually. After dropping Barbara off near her corner, David drove around town, occasionally swinging through the areas that Barbara took her jauns. I think it's sweet that he was trying to find her and look out for her when she had such a dangerous job. Unfortunately for both of them, David didn't see Barbara again, and he left the saloon that they had agreed to meet at sometime after 1 a.m. From there, we know that Andy and Robin picked Barbara up from a diner, and the rest of the night unfolded for Barbara in the way that we discussed earlier. She was killed in a way that was very, very similar to Doreen's. Okay, I know that was a lot, so I'm going to do a small recap so that we're all on the same page for this next part. 2 young women are found dead 4 weeks apart, and they are both killed in very similar ways. The second murder victim, Barbara, was killed on November 8th, 1979, and fragments of her remains were found on January 26th, 1980. Barbara's boyfriend, Andy, goes to the police station to tell them about his psychic dream. Police arrest Andy on February 7th, 1980 for Barbara's murder. And that brings us up to date on everything that has happened so far. Remember, guys, there's still one more graphic murder in this freaking nonsense. Poor Karen tried so hard to do the right thing, even though she was absolutely terrified. Karen spent most of the day on February 8th, 1980 with Detective Sylvia, walking him through the areas where Carl and his crew conducted their blood rituals. She confessed that every full moon, the cult would either sacrifice stray animals or an innocent woman and ritualistically sacrifice them, which was apparently news for Detective Sylvia and Detective Alves. In case you don't remember, Detective Alves was the area expert on satanic cults, so, how the police and a satanic cult expert who worked a block and a half from the red light district were totally unaware of these other murders is a total mystery to me, even though those murders are technically unconfirmed. Karen was with Detective Sylvia until about 8 that evening, and her 2-year-old son had spent the day with Karen's grandmother. At the end of an emotionally exhausting day, Karen asked Detective Sylvia to drop her off at a local Catholic church, to which the detective obliged. As they drove to the church, Sylvia called his superiors to get Karen approved for placement in protective custody. And even though she was approved for it, Karen elected to not go back to the police station with Sylvia. He dropped her off at the church around 8 p.m. I can't help but wonder if perhaps Karen's story would have ended differently if she had chosen to go into protective custody that night. What happened next, we know from the testimonies of Carol Fletcher and Robin Murphy. Carol Fletcher worked the streets for Robin and just so happened to be Karen's roommate. Now, Carol claims that she never met Carl Drew, which is super interesting considering she was a prostitute living with other prostitutes and her apartment was used for, those purposes. Not only that, but Carol held black masses in her apartment. At least that's what Detective Alves claimed. Alves stated in the Fall River documentary that he had never actually seen a black mass performed until he staked out Carol's apartment. So, whether the black mass bit is true or not, I think her not knowing Carl is a lie and an unnecessary one at that. Anyways, we don't know what happened to Karen after Detective Sylvia dropped her off at the church. We don't know how long she spent there, who she spoke to, or if she planned to meet with anyone there or afterwards. What we do know is that eventually she met up with Carol and Robin for a little car ride through the city. And oddly enough, Carol was driving a rental car that night. The girls drove up and down Bedford Street, which made up the majority of the red light district. At some point during the drive, the notoriously violent pimp Carl Drew and another local pimp by the name of Carl Davis got into Carol's car. For clarity's sake, I'll refer to Carl Davis by his last name. So going forward, we're going to have Carol, Carl, and Davis because it wasn't confusing enough to begin with. Things turned sour pretty quickly after Carl and Davis got into the car. Davis directed Carol to drive to Family Beach in Westport, Massachusetts, which is just 6 miles away from Fall River. I don't think I need to tell you that this was not a fun beach trip. At least not for Carol and Karen. Once the car was parked, Carol pulled a screaming Karen out of the car by her hair and throat and dragged her into the woods behind the beach. Is anyone noticing Robin's pattern here? She sure does like to pull her girls around by the hair, doesn't she? Carol, Carl, and Davis walked behind Robin as she dragged Karen away from the car. Quick disclaimer before things get graphic. I don't really know or understand geographical layouts. Hearing that there's a big wooded area adjacent to a beach seemed funky to me, but I've never been to Massachusetts, so maybe that's a thing. My point is, I don't know. According to Carol, once the group was sufficiently covered by the trees, Carl and Robin began to pick up rocks and chuck them at Karen. Next, Robin claims Carl forced her to perform oral sex on Karen's dead body. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if Karen did this of her own accord, especially with her willingness to engage in the other murders. Eventually, Carl told Robin to slit Karen's throat. Carl then dipped his fingers in Karen's blood and drew a cross on Robin's forehead with the blood, indoctrinating her into his little fucked up cult. Which doesn't make a lot of sense because Robin and Carl were bitter rivals. But I hope you guys are at least seeing the behavior patterns here. Karen's throat was slit to the bone. Carl ripped her head off with his bare hands. He and Davis used Karen's head as a soccer ball. And then the group got back into Carol's rental and just went home, I guess. The next day, February 9th, 1980, Karen's grandmother, who still had Karen's 2-year-old son, JJ, reported Karen missing. Karen's remains weren't found for the next 2 months. Finally, on April 13th, 1980, the top portion of Carol's skull was found. Unlike with Barbara, most of Karen's body was never recovered. She was discovered amongst piles of sheep and cat bones, clumps of human hair, women's clothing and accessories, and just other bizarre items. It really seems like the satanic ritualistic sacrifice angle was oversold here. Carol, who provided most of the details of Karen's murder, didn't mention any kind of ritual being done with Karen's body, nor did she mention any of the paraphernalia found alongside Karen's body. This really makes me wonder if someone didn't go out later and stage the scene. And if one of the other 3 involved with her murder did go back to stage the scene, then which one was it? Or did all 3 go back later? If I had to guess, my money would be on Robin staging it. As shocking as it is to believe, the police were not idle during the 2 months it took to locate Karen's body. Because of the crowd she was involved in, the Fall River police had a pretty good idea of where to start. One person they visited was Robin's ex-girlfriend, Maureen Sparta. Police showed up to Maureen's home to ask her about Robin, and it just so happened that Robin called Maureen while the investigators were there. Maureen gave police permission to listen to the call, allowing investigators to set Robin's arrest into motion. During the call, Robin spilled all the gory details of what she had done to Karen. Robin would have a hell of a time wiggling out of this one. Maureen wasn't the only person willing to help get these monsters off the streets. Carol, who was involved in Karen's murder, also talked to police and spilled what she knew, which is why we were able to get a more complete story of Karen's final hours versus the final hours for Barbara and Doreen. Carol admitted to police that Carl had told her just days before the murder that he had planned to kill Karen when the time was right. And according to Karen's grandmother, Andy had been threatening to kill Karen for weeks before he was arrested for Barbara's murder. If Andy had been there, would Karen have been bound with fishing wire and brutally raped while she was alive, just like with Doreen and Barbara? With Andy having been arrested the day before Karen's murder, the only person who was present at all 3 slayings was Robin Murphy, who, in case you've forgotten, is still only 17. Another area prostitute, Leah Johnson, came forward to talk to state police after Karen's body was found. Leah was dating Carl at the time of Karen's murder and informed the investigators that he had gifted her a ring around the time Karen went missing. The investigators took the ring into evidence. Karen's mother would testify at Carl's trial that the ring he had given Leah Johnson belonged to Karen. This ring is the only piece of physical evidence that ties him to Karen's murder. According to Leah, Carl had bragged to her about how he had killed a girl with Robin, Davis, and another girl. He ended his little monologue by telling Leah that he killed the girl because she wanted to leave the Colts, and he killed her slowly because he wanted her to, quote, feel pain. Now, I'm not a gambling man, but if I were, I'd wager that Karen's desire to get away from Carl wasn't the only thing that got her killed. Karen was willing to provide a much more detailed version of events from the night of Doreen's murder, and the evidence would have been too damning to ignore. So, I think Karen was really killed to keep her from revealing any more than she already had. But I'll bet he was smart enough to know that Karen's testimony in court would carry more weight than Robin's. And I think Robin knew that if Karen told her version of events, her plea deal would be voided. The first person to go to trial was Andy Malte. His trial stayed local, and, true to her word, Robin Murphy was the star witness at his trial. She appeared in court with an innocent girl-next-door look, a small cross necklace displayed outside her sweater. She gave a rather undetailed account of Barbara's murder, obviously, omitting her own sinister role. On January 30th, 1981, Andy Malte was charged with first-degree murder and given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. By August of 1982, Andy and his attorneys had already filed for an appeal, claiming that his trial had been unfair for a number of reasons. First, Andy's legal team claimed that his initial confession, aka his psychic dream, was coerced. Their reasoning for this is that Andy himself didn't volunteer to take police to the crime scene, but rather was asked by the DA's office if he'd be willing to provide a tour. This point was thrown out pretty quickly. According to the paperwork provided by the original investigators, including audio recordings of their conversations with Andy, he had been reminded of his right to remain silent on 4 separate instances before being taken to the crime scene. Andy acknowledged that he understood his rights each time, so obviously, this claim was pretty quickly dismissed. Andy also accused the jury of being impartial, talking amongst themselves during breaks. He called into question the credibility of Robin's testimony, which I think is actually a valid point, as well as the credibility of the dentist used to identify Barbara's teeth. The dentist in question had never spoken at a trial before, but he was licensed to practice dentistry in 3 states. So the judge ruled that this dentist was properly qualified to make that determination. And he also had his legal team pursue an appeal for an impartial jury and jury manipulation by the prosecution, both of which were also dismissed. Ultimately, Andy's case didn't get an appeal or a retrial, and the sadist would die behind bars from cancer in 1998. The trials of the other individuals happened quickly, but these lucky folks got a change of venue due to the case's increasing popularity in Bristol County. Roughly 84 miles away, the murder trials of Robin Murphy, Carl Drew, and Carl Davis began in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. Apart from the testimonies of Carol Fletcher and Robin Murphy, there was no evidence to tie Davis to any of these crimes, and Davis gave no confession. So there was nothing the courts could use to charge him. Davis's case was dropped, but he would be arrested a year later for attempted murder against Maureen Sparta, Robin Murphy's ex-girlfriend, and then he received a 7-year sentence for that crime. 7 years for attempted murder is grossly inadequate, in my opinion, but I guess some justice is better than none at all. As part of Robin's plea deal, she pled guilty to the 2nd-degree murder of Karen Marsden. In the state of Massachusetts, a 2nd-degree murder charge comes with the possibility of parole, whereas a 1st-degree murder charge does not, which of course means that Karen got a lesser sentence for an exceptionally vicious murder compared to her male counterparts. In exchange for her lesser sentence, though, she had to testify against Carl Drew. The story Robin presents at Carl's trial is different from the story she handed to the DA's office when she struck her plea deal. Why this shift in stories didn't cost her the plea deal, I'll never understand. One of my coworkers has an associate's degree in forensic science, and when I asked him, he said that that would ultimately be up to the DA's discretion. And I think that was a pretty dumb call on the DA's part, if you ask me. If you can recall from earlier in our episode, when Robin took control of the narrative initially by bypassing law enforcement and taking her confession straight to the DA, she implicated Andy Malte for Doreen Levesque's murder. This version of events honestly makes a lot of sense to me. Andy and Robin were the only one present at Doreen's and Barbara's murders, and both women were killed in the exact same way. The biggest difference between these two murders is the additional mutilation performed on Doreen that wasn't present on Barbara. I have a theory for that too, but I'll save that for a little further along in the story. We are far from being over, my friends. Did you really think I'd leave this case bundled up so neatly for you? You should know me better than that by now. When Robin took the stand at Carl's trial, it wasn't Andy she implicated. In fact, in her new version of events, Andy wasn't present at all at Doreen's murder. This time, under oath and in front of a jury, Robin recounted Doreen's death with Carl as the one calling the shots. Naturally, she downplayed her own role in the murder, painting herself as just this helpless victim in the presence of violent men. After about 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Carl Drew guilty for the first-degree murder of Karen Marsden. A first-degree murder charge in Massachusetts doesn't allow for parole. Luckily for Carl, though, Massachusetts had absolved the death penalty just a couple years prior. If they hadn't have done that, there is absolutely zero doubt that they would have gotten the death penalty for these murders. Just because of how, excessively violent and grotesque they were. Also tried his hand at an appeal. On November 4th, 1985, Carl filed a writ of habeas corpus, citing 6 reasons for his wrongful imprisonment. He felt like the judge had made some decisions for his case that resulted in an unfair trial. Apparently, when Carl and Davis were initially apprehended, Davis had written a note confessing to his role in Karen's murder and passed it to another inmate. After the inmate read the note and passed it back, Davis destroyed the note by eating it and refused to replicate it. Carl felt slighted by the judge not allowing the unnamed inmate to testify on his behalf, while also allowing Robin to testify against him. Honestly, I think this is a fair argument. There was a reason the judge allowed one testimony and not the other. However, I'm not a lawyer, so the quoted statutes, quite honestly, meant nothing to me. But if you're a lawyer or a detective and you can feel free to comment or email me and explain it to me, because I would really love to know. Carl also felt that his religious alignment and prior rap sheet was irrelevant to the trial. Once again, the trial judge disagreed and allowed his religious practices and rap sheet to be presented as evidence at the trial because, and I quote, "They are inextricably intertwined with the description of events on the night of the killing." And finally, Carl felt it was unfair that he was not permitted to sit with his counsel during his trial. While Carl's lawyer was a practicing attorney, this was his first and his last murder case. Carl felt that had he been permitted to sit next to his lawyer, he would have been able to provide more clear details of the night in question. The trial judge had made that call in court because tools of escape were found in Carl's cell, and 3 fellow inmates testified that they had a group escape plan. Because of that, the judge felt Carl was a safety risk and sat him next to the bailiff, which, once again, it doesn't make sense to me why the judge took the testimony of those 3 inmates to, make Carl sit away from his representation, but wouldn't take the testimony of the other inmate who allegedly read that note. Though I guess if I had to reckon, I'd say Satanic Panic had something to do with that. Basically, Carl's appeal came down to him feeling railroaded during his trial. While I personally don't believe Carl was railroaded, I certainly understand why he feels that way, especially because his trial judge justified separating Carl from his counsel based on the claims of 3 unnamed inmates. Whatever hearsay statutes they were citing kind of seems like a CYA. I think the judge was scared of Carl's reputation and as a Satanist, and that's why he moved him further away. Needless to say, Carl was denied a retrial on March 12, 1986. Unless any new, actual physical evidence is conjured, Carl will never get a chance at freedom again. Because he's already used up his appeal. Believe it or not, there is a large group of people who believe Carl Drew is totally innocent of these crimes. Carl has a weird relationship with his conviction for Karen's murder specifically. He maintains that he did not kill Karen Marsden or Doreen Levesque, but he does admit he's not a good person and probably belongs behind bars. The small detail is the only thing that casts a shadow of a doubt in my mind, but frankly, I still believe he was involved. Carl also believed himself to be some kind of white knight for these prostitutes, which is absolutely crazy. He claims he asked for $200 a week in exchange for his protection, but as we can see by his reputation, he did very little to protect these women. In fact, he regularly abused them and kept them drugged and drunk to keep them compliant with his horrific sacrificial rituals and the lifestyles they lived. And to be completely fair here, if this was the life that I was forced into, I would probably want to be drunk or high all the time to help cope with my reality. Absolutely no shade on my end towards these vulnerable women. I am blaming Carl for how he treated them. Now, Carl's case sounds pretty solid, and I think most of us would agree he's right where he should be. However, there are a shocking amount of people who believe in Carl's innocence. You see, there are a few issues with Carl's conviction for Karen's murder, which is the only murder he was charged with, that many can't ignore. Personally, I think most of the reasons have pretty simple answers, but I would be remiss to not share them with you. One problem is that he had an alibi that checks out for the majority of the night on February 8th, 1980. There are photos of Carl at his former stepmother's wedding to corroborate this alibi, and Carl claims he didn't leave the wedding until close to midnight. If that's true, then it's impossible he was in the woods for Karen's murder, which is believed to have taken place around 11 p.m. that night. Or without Carl's alibi, though it is solid, it's tricky to pin down if he was involved based off of just his alibi, because no one was able to give an exact timeline for when Karen was pulled into the woods, and no one was able to give an exact timeline of when Carl left the wedding reception. And the testimonies that were offered about this case were shaky at best, because the women who were giving the testimonies to these crimes were drugged, and they were addicts and alcoholics, and just they were unreliable narrators is what it boils down to. So while his alibi is really strong and really solid, it's really hard to prove, because no one can say what time he left the wedding, and no one can say what time Karen was pulled kicking and screaming from the car and into the woods. I don't know, guys. Production team for the Fall River documentary, which consisted of a couple of investigative journalists and a private investigator and the actual production team, set out to prove Carl's innocence based off of the evidence that I've already listed. As part of their independent investigation, the PI and the production team were able to track down Carol Fletcher and Leah Johnson. However, the biggest problems with these new testimonies that they got is that Carol is on a cocktail of medications to treat anxiety, depression, and PTSD that her time as a prostitute caused. And a lot of those medications are linked to memory loss. Leah Johnson has been in and out of jail numerous times since her initial testimony, and she's still an active addict, or she was as of 2022. So once again, we're forced to question the validity of their recanted statements. Additionally, they were found over 20 years after Carl's trial. So realistically, would they even be able to remember a Friday night from 20 plus years ago, even if they had been sober, let alone from a time in their life where they were kept drugged and drunk to be complicit? Their testimonies to begin with weren't the most reliable, and they're even more unreliable now, 40 years later. Regardless of whether or not you consider them to be credible witnesses, both women were willing to talk to the film crew, and both of them more or less said the same thing. Carol asserted that she had never actually met Carl Drew before his trial, and that she simply knew him by reputation and was willing to believe that he'd be able to do something that heinous. She also claimed that her story about Carl's involvement was coerced. Leah Johnson, Carl's then girlfriend, said something similar. Leah claimed that the story she gave the state police about the ring she turned over for evidence was also false. She too claimed that she had been intimidated by law enforcement to give a false statement. Karen's mother, however, confirmed that the ring turned over to police belonged to her daughter. The biggest issue with these secondary claims, apart from the time that elapsed between the events, is that both women are still unwilling to say how they felt coerced or who they were intimidated by. Anyone who worked on this case back then has long since retired, so who exactly are they scared of now? Especially because at the time of these interviews, Carl Drew was still in prison, is still in prison, and so was Robin Murphy. So who were they scared of? The piece of evidence, or rather the lack thereof, that really solidified Carl's innocence for the production team was the lack of blood found in Carol's rental car from the night of the murder. If Karen's head had been removed in the woods, as the original narrative claims, then Carl, Davis, Robin, and Carol would have had blood all over them, and it would have been all over the rental car. But when police searched the vehicle, albeit several days later, there was no evidence of foul play in the vehicle. Now, does this mean that the murder didn't happen as described? No, not necessarily. Because it took the police several days to find the right rental car and secure a warrant to search it. It's entirely possible that any evidence was cleaned from the car. It's also possible that someone left at some point to swap cars, or some stayed behind and walked home, or another of other options, really. I mean, Karen was killed where many of their black masses were held, so they were already at their stomping grounds anyway. What I'm saying is the lack of blood in the rental car isn't the damning evidence of Carl's innocence like the production team leads viewers to believe. Robin's plea deal came with the possibility of parole, a fact that she has taken full advantage of. She has appeared in front of the Massachusetts Parole Board 8 times. Her first attempt at parole came in 1995, just 14 years after her arrest. She was immediately denied. She made a bid for parole again in 1998, 2002, and 2004. Massachusetts Parole Board denied her claims for freedom in 1998 and 2002, but in 2004, Robin was released for the first time, which is insanity because she admitted before the parole board that she lied during her 1981 testimony against Carl Drew to make the story more believable. She claimed that her willingness to admit that she lied shows she's been rehabilitated, and she firmly believed that the 24 years she had served at that time was sufficient for her role in 3 murders. Astonishingly, she was released. Robin lived as a free woman until 2011, when she violated a condition of her parole by forming an intimate relationship with a former felon. But of course, her reincarceration hasn't tapered her resolve to live the rest of her life as a free woman. Robin's first go at parole came just a year later in 2012. Obviously, she was denied this time, but it didn't stop her from going before the parole board again in 2017 and 2022. Again, she was denied both times. Then, Robin applied for parole again in 2024, bringing her to a total of 8 parole hearings. Yeesh. Talk about a waste of taxpayer money. In her 2024 parole hearing, Robin admitted to lying on the stand again, but promises she's rehabilitated for good this time. When the members of the board pushed Robin for more details and gave her the opportunity to set the record straight, she refused. What I'm about to tell you is going to leave you gobsmacked. She was granted parole in March of 2024. Her release came with stipulations, obviously. She's required to report to her parole officer regularly, attend all scheduled therapy sessions for codependency, and she was required to keep a curfew and wear an ankle monitor for 90 days after her release. And there has been no more news on Robin since. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to summarize this gory madness with my own theory. If you stayed with me so far, thank you. I know this story has been a lot of names, locations, dates, details, just everything. You're a trooper. Stay with me. So, we have Doreen Levesque. She was bound, stoned, sexually assaulted, and mutilated posthumously. Robin Murphy, Andy Malte, and Carl Drew were all present for this murder, according to Karen's testimony. Then we have Barbara Raposa. She was bound, stoned, and sexually assaulted, but she wasn't mutilated after she died. Robin Murphy and Andy Malte were present for the second murder by Andy's and Robin's own admissions. Stay with me now. Finally, we have Karen Marsden. She was stoned, then mutilated, and sexually assaulted posthumously, but she wasn't bound. Carl Drew and Robin Murphy were present for the third murder, according to Carol Fletcher. And this, my crafty friends, brings us to my theory. When you take the motives, the drama, and the webs of lies away, you're left with evidence. In the case of the Fall River cult murders, I see 3 young women who were savagely slain in shockingly similar ways. It appears to me that if you combine the murders of Barbara and Karen, you get a scene that looks like Doreen's. This suggests, to me at least, that at least 2 killers are responsible. Now, both of these monsters masquerading as men are undeniably awful people, but Did you notice how neither one was there for all 3 murders? Yet all 3 women were killed the same way? And all 3 women were missing clumps of hair? And who pulled the women out by their hair all 3 times? Well, it was Robin. Both men may have had similar MOs, probably because of their shared religious beliefs. But as you can see, they had their preferences, and when you examine each murder individually, it becomes very obvious. According to Carol and Karen, Robin was all too happy to participate in this brutality, and I mean, she was the only one there at all 3 murders. So it's my belief that Robin incited the murders by whispering in the ears of the other pimps and of the girls. Everyone involved already knew each other and participated in satanic rituals involving bloodbaths, animal sacrifice, and forced orgies together as is. Is it really so far-fetched to think that Robin, who once again, I cannot stress this fact enough, was the only person present at every murder, saw tensions within the group and used that as leverage to elevate her own status in the streets? Because I don't think that that's a crazy idea. And if it does sound unbelievable, then let's revisit her reputation. Detective Alan Sylvia described Robin as the type of person who could eat a piece of pizza and kill you right after and not have a single problem with it. She was mean enough to pick bar fights with adult men and was cunning enough to be running a prostitution ring at 17 years old. She is obviously not stupid. If anything, her character shows she's violent, manipulative, cunning, but most importantly, smart. Additionally, Robin is a known liar. Think of how many people she manipulated. She managed to pull wool over the eyes of investigators, the DA's office, the courts, and the parole board. Twice. She even denied knowing Andy Malte was a child predator to the Fall River production crew, while also telling the parole board in that same documentary that she lied about Andy's involvement to make sure that he couldn't molest other children in the same ways that he had molested her. You see the problem here? The psychiatrist she saw while incarcerated informed the courts that Robin had codependency issues and is a pathological liar. So why does she keep getting released? And despite admitting that she lied on stand, Robin still refuses to set the record straight. Like, sure, she admits to the lying and she says she's ready to give the real story. But if you notice, every time she says that, or you read the transcripts from the parole hearings or watch the documentary, she's willing to do anything but tell the truth. She doesn't actually set the story straight. Her favorite line seems to be that no one will believe me now. Well, Robin, babe, if you've really changed, go ahead and show us. I think the real reason she won't admit to what she's done is because she knows she played a bigger part in the murders than she originally led folks to believe. And she knows that if she told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, well, her chances at Pearl would disappear altogether. I mean, if she confesses to being the ones pulling the strings, who would want to let her out, you know? And that, my crafty friends, is the gruesome and gory tale of the Fall River cult murders. What do you think? Did I make good on my promise to prove to you that Robin Murphy masterminded these murders? What's your take on Carl's innocence? Is the alibi with the photos enough to exonerate him, or do you need a little more too? Did he kill Karen and possibly Doreen? Do you have anything else you'd like to say about the show? Let me